Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of 17th century England, decoding human trajectories not through the decrees of monarchs, but through the quiet, invisible ledgers of everyday life. What if I told you that the most revolutionary event in 17th century England wasn't the execution of a king or a bloody civil war, but a quiet, almost unnoticeable drop in the birth rate? And before we dive in, I'm genuinely curious. What city? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories always make my night. So, get comfortable, adjust your volume, let the harsh glare of the modern world fade away into the background. Close your eyes and let the darkness settle in. We are going back. We are stepping into the year 1600. History books love the spectacle of kings. They love the flash of steel, the grand speeches, the dramatic beheadings on cold January mornings. But true power, the kind of power that actually shifts the foundations of a society, rarely announces itself with trumpets. It moves like a deep ocean current, silent, relentless, unseen until the landscape has completely changed. If you want to understand why the absolute power of the Stuart Dynasty crumbled, you don't look at the crown, you look at the balance sheets of the ordinary people. Imagine a scene painted in deep, melancholic oils, heavy shadows clinging to the damp walls of a rural English cottage. It is a harsh, almost Gothic reality. For a century, the population of England had been climbing, steadily, inexorably. By the middle of the 17th century, it would hit a peak of nearly 5.3 million people. More people meant more pressure, pressure on the land, pressure on the food supply, pressure on the very fabric of survival. Between the years 1500 and 1640, something terrifying happened to the English economy. It was a slow-motion crisis. The price of food multiplied by 8. Let that sink in. An 8-fold increase in the cost of basic sustenance, but wages? The price of human labour? That didn't even triple. It was a brutal structural margin squeeze. For the vast majority of people, those who didn't own land, those who had to buy their bread, living standards plummeted. They were trapped in a cycle of diminishing returns. Every year their labour bought less. Every year the spectre of hunger crept a little closer to the hearth. You either adapted, or you fell into the abyss of the parish poor relief. But humans are remarkably rational creatures when pushed to the edge. When faced with an economic environment this unforgiving, the English people didn't just starve, they adapted. They changed their behaviours. They made quiet, deeply personal sacrifices that would eventually reshape the entire nation. They stopped having so many children. It wasn't a decree from London. It was a collective, unspoken strategy of risk management. In an agrarian economy where land is finite and food is wildly expensive, having a large family isn't a blessing. It is a massive liability. To survive, the English instituted a cultural habit of late marriage. Across all social classes, men and women began delaying their weddings until their mid-20s, often waiting until they were 26 or older. In the 17th century, a lifespan was already fragile and short. Waiting until 26 to marry meant stripping away a huge portion of a woman's reproductive years. Why did they wait? Capital accumulation. There was a stubborn, deeply ingrained tradition that you simply did not marry until you had saved enough money to establish an independent household. You needed a financial moat before you could afford love. For the sons of the wealthy, this meant long years at university or studying the law. But for the poor, it meant a grueling decade of domestic service or apprenticeship. 7 long years, sometimes more, living under an employer's roof, working for board and lodging, earning mere pennies, saving every single fraction of a shilling, waiting, enduring the delay of personal gratification just to buy the right to start a family. And even when they did marry, they carefully managed their risk. Families deliberately limited their size. And also prize. Women would nurse their second or third child for much longer periods than their first, using extended breastfeeding as a natural suppressant to further pregnancies. They used whatever crude contraceptive methods were available. They adopted a prudent, calculated attitude toward intimacy. This collective, decentralized decision-making worked. The birth rate slowed. The relentless demographic pressure began to ease. But this era of extreme inflation didn't just create poverty. Volatility always creates opportunity for those positioned on the right side of the trade. While the bottom of society was being crushed by food prices, and the ancient nobility at the very top was slowly bleeding out, a new class was quietly consolidating power. Think about the old aristocracy, the great lords of the realm. They possessed massive estates, but their wealth was tied up in long-term leases with fixed, customary rents. As inflation raged over a century, their fixed income lost its purchasing power. They were holding the 17th century equivalent of low-yield bonds during a period of hyperinflation. They were asset-rich, but cash-poor, slowly eroding their own structural advantages. But the middle layers of society, the yeoman farmers, the local merchants, the master craftsmen, they were living in a different reality. If a yeoman farmer owned a decent stretch of land and could produce more grain than his family needed to eat, he had a surplus. And in a market where food prices had increased eightfold, that surplus was pure gold. They sold high, and because the population boom had created a massive, desperate pool of unemployed labourers, they could hire farmhands for next to nothing. Their revenue was tied to inflation, but their labour costs were depressed. It was a perfect financial engine. These men weren't aristocrats. They wore leather, not silk. They read and wrote in plain English, not Latin. They worked with their hands. But they understood the cold, compounding logic of wealth. With their excess cash, they didn't buy lavish clothes or host grand banquets. They reinvested. They became the quiet bankers of the countryside. Long before modern banks or mortgages existed, these wealthy yeomen loaned money to their starving neighbours. And when a bad harvest hit and the neighbour couldn't pay the interest, the yeoman foreclosed. He took the land. It was a ruthless, decades-long consolidation of assets, a slow-motion leveraged buyout of the English countryside. They absorbed the small plots, expanded their operations, and achieved economies of scale. They grew richer, harder, and more ambitious. Many of these men accumulated enough capital to effectively buy their way up the social ladder. They purchased manors. They paid the heralds to grant them coats of arms. They transitioned from working farmers to gentlemen who lived off their investments. The old, established gentry hated them. They viewed these new arrivals with absolute contempt, seeing them as vulgar social climbers who were devaluing the very concept of nobility. To protect their own fragile egos and exclusive status, the old guard even invented a new term for themselves, insisting they be called squires. But titles and snobbery cannot stop the gravity of economics. By the late 17th century, a new, highly pragmatic elite had formed. They were a hybrid class. They owned country estates, but they also invested heavily in overseas trade, in government debt, in mining, and in the new, intensive agricultural technologies crossing over from the Netherlands. They spent half their time managing rural harvests and the other half in the bustling, increasingly commercial streets of London. They were not burdened by the romantic, medieval notions of chivalry or divine right. They were men of ledgers, contracts, and property rights. They understood that wealth was no longer just a static privilege of birth. It was a dynamic, volatile force that had to be actively managed and protected. And hovering above all of this structural transformation was the Stuart monarchy, a government blissfully, tragically unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath its feet. The kings of England still operated under the illusion that they were the absolute centre of the universe. They believed their power descended directly from God. But in reality, their bureaucratic machinery was pitifully small. The entire national government was run by fewer than 1,000 salaried officials. They had no standing army, no professional police force. To collect taxes, to enforce the law, to maintain the militia, the king relied entirely on the voluntary cooperation of the local gentlemen in the counties. He relied on the very class of men who were quietly becoming the most economically powerful and independent force in the nation. The Crown's resources were no longer sufficient to meet its ambitions, nor were they enough to manage a rapidly modernising, complex national economy. The king was expected to arbitrate between irreconcilable interests, to keep bread cheap for the starving poor, while protecting the profits of the rising agrarian capitalists. It was an impossible mandate. The stage was being set. A new class of men, hardened by economic competition and highly protective of their newly won property, was rising. And at the top, a monarchy armed with ancient theories but severely lacking in modern leverage was trying to hold back the tide. The collision was inevitable. It wouldn't just require a political spark. It would require leaders who were disconnected from reality, men whose personal flaws would act as an accelerant on the dry tinder of a changing society. And as the 1600s dawned, England was about to be handed over to a king whose intellectual brilliance was matched only by his profound, self-destructive lack of common sense. Chapter 2. The Illusion of the Crown. When Queen Elizabeth died in 1603, an entire era died with her. The Tudor dynasty had mastered the ultimate political asset, mystique. Elizabeth had managed her public image with the ruthless precision of a modern corporate monopoly. She was the Virgin Queen, distant, glorious, and untouchable. But when the crown passed to her Scottish cousin, James I, the first of the Stuart kings, that carefully constructed illusion of majesty began to crack. Imagine James riding south from Scotland to claim his new throne. He is stepping into an England that is rapidly changing. As we saw in the dark, quiet corners of the countryside, a new class of men is rising. Men of property, men of ledgers, men who calculate risk and reward with cold precision. These men needed a CEO. What they got was a philosopher who couldn't balance his own checkbook. James I was a man of profound contradictions. History has often been cruel to him, and in many ways, he earned it. But we have to understand his intellect before we can understand his failure. He was arguably the most highly educated monarch to ever sit on the English throne. He was a scholar. He wrote complex theoretical treatises on the nature of government. He engaged in fierce, highly articulate debates with Catholic theologians across Europe. He even wrote extensively on the dangers of witchcraft and the new, exotic habit of smoking tobacco. He had a crystal clear, entirely consistent vision of absolute power. In his mind, he was God's appointed lieutenant on earth. He believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the theory that a monarch is accountable to no earthly authority, only to the Almighty. But there is a massive difference between writing about absolute power and actually wielding it. In practice, James was a mess. The French king Henry IV famously dubbed him the wisest fool in Christendom, and the title stuck because it was agonizingly accurate. James understood the theory of his own supremacy, but he also realized that, practically speaking, his hands were tied. He knew he was bound by his coronation oath to uphold the laws and customs of the realm. He knew he couldn't pass legislation or raise direct taxes without summoning Parliament. He knew his actions were subject to judicial review, and yet he possessed a fatal inability to read the room. Picture him standing before the House of Commons in 1621. He looks out at the very men who are consolidating the wealth of the nation, the lawyers, the squires, the merchants. And what does he tell them? He tells them that all their ancient privileges, all their legal rights, are merely gifts bestowed upon them by his personal grace. He didn't actually try to take those rights away. He just felt an overwhelming, academic need to remind them that he could, theoretically, take them away because they belonged to him by divine right. It was a disastrous miscalculation. In the volatile world of finance and politics, you do not remind your major shareholders that you have the theoretical power to wipe out their equity. You don't trigger a constitutional crisis just to win a philosophical debate. But his intellectual vanity was only half the problem. The real damage, the rot that would eventually hollow out the Stuart dynasty, was moral and financial. Let us look at the ledger. There is a persistent myth that the early Stuart kings were poor, that they were constantly on the verge of bankruptcy because of a broken tax system. The truth is much more fascinating and much more damning. When James inherited the throne, his annual revenue was roughly £350,000. As the century progressed, the English economy expanded. Trade began to boom. Because the Crown collected duties on imports and exports, the king's revenue grew organically, far outpacing inflation. By the late 1630s, the royal income would swell to £1 million a year. The money was there. In times of peace, the Stuart crown had more than enough cash flow to run the country. In fact, throughout the entire 17th century, the Stuarts were among the least indebted monarchs in all of Europe. The problem was not a lack of revenue. The problem was a complete, catastrophic lack of discipline. James was famously unkempt. He hated washing. He had a thick tongue that made his speech sloppy, and he was terrified of physical violence. But his sloppiness wasn't just physical. It infected his entire administration. He treated the royal treasury like a bottomless slush fund. He handed out pensions, titles, and cash gifts with reckless abandon, desperately trying to buy the love and loyalty of his courtiers. It was a massive misallocation of capital. He inflated the market for honours, cheapening the very concept of nobility. And as he poured money into the hands of his favourites, the bureaucratic machinery of the state began to rust. Embezzlement became rampant. Government officials skimmed from the top. The royal balance sheet was bleeding out through 1,000 tiny, corrupt cuts. Imagine being a puritanical merchant in London or a wealthy yeoman farmer in the Shires. You have spent your entire life denying yourself luxury. You delayed marriage for a decade. You save every penny. You count every bushel of wheat. And then you look at the court of King James. What you see is a carnival of grotesque excess. You see a government where the public image is being dragged through the mud by a series of spectacular, sordid scandals. Between 1618 and 1619, the corruption broke into the open. A former Lord Chamberlain, a former Lord Treasurer, a former Secretary of State, and a former Captain of the Gentlemen Pensioners, some of the highest-ranking executives in the kingdom, were all thrown into the Tower of London. The charges weren't just about financial mismanagement. They involved sex crimes. They involved murder. The moral authority of the crown was evaporating. Respect is an intangible asset. But once a government loses it, every subsequent action becomes exponentially more difficult. The king was losing his moral mandate, and he was losing it to a society that was becoming increasingly austere, increasingly disciplined, and increasingly literate. And then there was the favourite. In 1618, James developed an intense, passionate relationship with a young, stunningly beautiful courtier named George Villiers. Villiers was a minor gentleman, with no significant wealth or standing, but he had the king's heart. Over the next few years, this young man was rocketed up the social and political hierarchy with terrifying speed. James made him the Duke of Buckingham. He was the first person outside the royal family to be elevated to a dukedom in over a century. Buckingham didn't just receive titles. He took over the government. As James grew older, sicker, and more detached from the daily grind of ruling, Buckingham became the de facto prime minister. He controlled the flow of patronage. He controlled access to the king. He eventually controlled foreign policy. To the rising, pragmatic class of England, Buckingham was a living, breathing symbol of everything wrong with the system. Here was a man who had not earned his position through merit, through military victory, or through economic genius. He had bypassed the entire structure of the English establishment simply because the king found him beautiful. This distorted the entire market of power. If you wanted to advance in business or law, you didn't work hard. You bribed someone who knew someone who could get a whisper in Buckingham's ear. It generated a deep, simmering resentment. Yet, we must be objective. For all his flaws, James I was not a tyrant, and his reign was not a total failure. He was a man of peace. He successfully ended the long war with Spain. He kept England out of the devastating 30 Years' War that was tearing the European continent to pieces. He managed to unite the crowns of England and Scotland, even if he failed to unite the hearts and minds of the two nations. He ruled according to the law. He called parliaments when he needed to, argued with them, and then sent them home without ever resorting to widespread violence. He hated some of his subjects, but he rarely hated them enough to kill them. There were no mass executions for treason. In fact, between 1605 and 1641, barely a single nobleman or gentleman was executed for political crimes. England, under James, was experiencing the longest period of domestic peace it had ever known. It was, on the surface, a golden age of stability, but stability without trust is an illusion. It is a hollow shell, waiting for a sudden shock to shatter it. James had preserved the peace, but he had exhausted the political capital of the monarchy. He had drained the reservoir of goodwill. He left behind a court that was widely despised for its corruption, a debt that was manageable but deeply unpopular, and a society that no longer believed the king was inherently superior to the men who actually generated the nation's wealth. In March 1625, James I died in his bed. His grand ambitions of European diplomacy and religious unity had faded into nothing. The throne passed smoothly, without a drop of spilled blood, to his surviving son. It was the most peaceful succession England had seen in centuries. But the son who took the crown was nothing like his father. Where James was loud, sloppy, and willing to compromise, the new king was quiet, pristine, and dangerously inflexible. The era of the wise fool was over. The era of the self-righteous martyr was about to begin. And the quiet economic forces that had been building in the dark were finally going to collide with a man who believed that reality could be bent to his will. Chapter 3. The Mathematics of Disaster. If James I was a loud, messy philosopher who talked too much, his son, Charles I, was a cold, silent architect who believed too much. James had been a man of words, often inappropriate ones, but Charles was a man of silence. He was a man of pristine, icy order, shadowed by a dangerous sense of moral superiority. Charles did not feel the need to explain his actions to his people. He believed that as a king, his motives were inherently pure, and his subjects' only duty was to understand that by instinct. To understand the tragedy of Charles, we have to look at the man himself. He was not the charismatic heir. He grew up in the shadow of his brilliant older brother Henry, whose sudden death left Charles with a crown he was perhaps never naturally suited for. He was small of stature, suffered from a persistent stammer, and was deeply self-conscious. In his mind, the chaos of his father's court, the drinking, the messy finances, the loose tongues, was a personal affront. When he took the throne in 1625, Charles immediately began to simplify his world. He believed that if a king could only set a perfect example, if he could establish absolute order and consistency, then obedience and peace would follow like a mathematical certainty. He purged the court of its blatant corruption. He paid off debts. He became a patron of the most refined French academic art. But beneath this surface of aesthetic perfection, there was a fatal lack of flexibility. Charles was a man who viewed compromise not as a tool of statecraft, but as a stain on his honour. The collision began, as it so often does, with the mathematics of war. Charles was a high-minded king, but he was also a reckless one in the international arena. Between 1625 and 1630, he stumbled into disastrous conflicts with both Spain and France. He wanted to defend the Protestant cause in Europe, but he lacked the one thing necessary to win a modern war: the consent of the people who held the purse strings. Parliament clamoured for war, but they refused to provide the funds to win it. They saw the king's favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, as an incompetent amateur, and they refused to trust him with the nation's wealth. Charles was humiliated. In his eyes, this was a betrayal of the basic contract between a king and his subjects. If they would not give him the money voluntarily, he would take it by other means. He resorted to forced loans, essentially demanding cash from the wealthy under the threat of imprisonment. When some refused, he threw them in jail without a trial. This wasn't just a tax dispute, it was a psychological breach. The rising class of gentry and merchants, the men who had spent decades building their private moats of capital, saw this as a direct assault on the concept of property itself. By 1639, the frustration had reached a breaking point. Charles, disgusted by what he saw as the petty obstructionism of the House of Commons, did something radical. He sent them home. He dissolved Parliament and decided that, for the foreseeable future, he would rule alone. This was the beginning of the personal rule, or, as his critics called it, the 11 years' tyranny. But for much of that time, it didn't feel like a tyranny. It felt like an era of eerie, efficient calm. Charles managed to balance the national budget for the first time in generations. He did this by staying out of wars and by exploiting every ancient, dusty legal loophole in the book to raise revenue without a parliament. The most famous of these was ship money. Traditionally, coastal towns paid a tax during wartime to provide for the navy. Charles took this ancient custom and applied it to the entire country, every single year, during peacetime. He argued that since the navy protected everyone's trade, everyone should pay. Logically, he was right. Politically, it was a disaster. It was a tax by another name, and it convinced the nation that the king was trying to build a government that no longer needed the consent of the governed. By 1637, Charles was at the absolute zenith of his power. The economy was booming, trade was flourishing, the budget was balanced. The Stuart monarchy seemed more stable than it had been in a century. But Charles wasn't content with just political order. He wanted spiritual order, and that is where he met William Laud. William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was the king's religious enforcer. Together, They launched a massive experiment to impose a singular, uniform vision on the English church. Laud hated the messiness of Puritanism, the spontaneous prayers, the lack of ritual, the focus on the individual's conscience. He wanted the beauty of holiness. He moved the communion tables back to the east end of the churches, railed them off behind fences, and insisted on ornate ceremonies that looked, to many, terrifyingly like Roman Catholicism. For the Puritans, this wasn't just a change in furniture, it was a betrayal of the Reformation. They felt the popery was being smuggled back into England through the side door. But Laud's reforms went deeper than ceremony. He attacked the wealth and the pride of the gentry. He tried to reclaim church lands and give bishops the power to judge secular gentlemen in church courts. He was trying to restore a medieval world in a society that was rapidly moving toward a commercial, individualistic future. The pressure began to build. Thousands of people, unable to stomach Laud's new church, made a desperate choice. They didn't rebel, not yet. They left. They packed their lives into small wooden ships and crossed the Atlantic to the New World. They headed for the wilderness of New England, seeking a place where they could build a city upon a hill, free from the eyes of the king's bishops. Then came the spark. Charles, in his obsession with integration, decided to force this same religious uniformity on Scotland. He forgot that the Scots were not a conquered people, but a proud, independent nation with a fierce Presbyterian soul. When the king's new prayer book was first read in Edinburgh, it triggered a riot that turned into a national revolution. The Scots signed a national covenant, declaring they would defend their religion to the death. Charles, ever the mathematician of disaster, decided to crush them with force. But war costs money, money the king no longer had. He tried to raise an army with his own limited funds, but the soldiers were poorly paid, poorly led, and had no interest in fighting their fellow Protestants. The Scots didn't just resist, they invaded. They marched into northern England, occupied Newcastle, and refused to leave until the king paid them for their trouble. Suddenly, the personal rule was dead. The balanced budget was a memory. The king was bankrupt, humiliated, and at the mercy of his enemies. In 1640, Charles had no choice. The 11-year silence was over. He was forced to call Parliament back. But the men who returned to Westminster were not the same men who had left in 1629. They were hardened. They were angry. And they were led by a man named John Pym, a brilliant political operative who understood the king's weaknesses better than the king did himself. Pym and his allies didn't just want to talk about taxes. They wanted to dismantle the entire system. They arrested the king's ministers, including Laud. They passed laws ensuring Parliament could never be dissolved without its own consent. They were stripping the king of his absolute prerogative, one brick at a time. The atmosphere in London turned toxic. The city was a powder keg of religious fervour and economic anxiety. And then, in late 1641, news arrived of a bloody Catholic uprising in Ireland. The reports were horrific. Rumours of thousands of Protestants being massacred, of children being murdered in their beds. For England, this was the ultimate trust exercise. An army had to be raised to stop the killing in Ireland, but who would lead it? Parliament didn't trust Charles with an army. They feared he would use it to turn back and crush them. Charles wouldn't give up his command. He saw it as the last shred of his royal honour. This was the deadlock. The trust between the king and his political elite had been utterly destroyed. Charles, pushed to the edge and convinced he was the victim of a radical conspiracy, made a final, desperate move. In January 1642, he marched into the House of Commons with a band of armed soldiers. He intended to arrest the 5 leaders of the opposition, including Pym, for treason. He walked up to the Speaker's chair and looked around. The room was silent. The men he sought were gone. They had been tipped off and had fled into the heart of London. Charles stood there, a small, stammering king in a room full of hostile faces, and uttered the famous words, "I see, all the birds are flown." It was a total public failure. The king had tried to use force and had failed. He could no longer stay in London. He fled the capital, moving north to gather those who were still loyal to the crown. In August 1642, in the city of Nottingham, Charles I raised his royal standard. It was a declaration of war against his own parliament. The quiet forces of economic change, the loud voices of religious passion, and the icy pride of a king had finally collided. The mathematics of disaster had reached its sum. England was no longer a kingdom, it was a battlefield. Chapter 4. The Great Extraction. The war did not begin with a single deafening explosion. It was a slow, agonizing descent into the abyss. In August 1642, when Charles I raised his royal standard in Nottingham, the wind was so high it blew the banner down. To those standing in the mud, it felt like an omen. But even then, most of England didn't believe they were entering a revolution. They thought it would be one battle, a single, sharp encounter to settle the king's honour, and then everyone would go home for the harvest. They were wrong. By October, the two sides met at Edgehill. It was a chaotic, bloody mess that settled absolutely nothing. As winter set in and the roads turned to sludge, the king retreated to Oxford, and the nation realised this was no longer a dispute. It was a transformation. In the mid-1640s, England became a landscape of moving steel. At any given moment, 1 out of every 10 adult men was under arms. Think about that. 10% of the fathers, the sons, the farmers and the craftsmen gone from the fields, marching down the lanes with pikes and muskets. While no single army was massive, rarely more than 20,000 men, the sheer scale of mobilisation was unprecedented. Across the country, 140,000 men were actively trying to kill each other. But this war wasn't just fought with steel, it was fought with the Great Extraction, a systematic, ruthless draining of the nation's wealth to feed the machine of conflict. Parliament held the ultimate strategic asset, London. The capital was the heart of English finance, the centre of trade, and a bottomless well of manpower. But even with London, Parliament found that traditional taxes weren't enough. To win, they had to reinvent the state into a predatory entity. If you lived in an area controlled by Parliament, you faced a new reality. They didn't just ask for money, they took it. Direct taxes surged to 20% of a family's income. Imagine working 5 days a week and knowing that one of those days was strictly for the war. Then came the excise, a new, hated sales tax on the absolute necessities of life. Beer. Salt. In an age before tea or coffee, beer was what everyone drank, from the toddler to the grandfather. Salt was the only way to preserve meat for the winter. By taxing these, Parliament was reaching into every single pantry in the kingdom. And if you were a royalist, a delinquent in Parliament's eyes, it was worse. Your estates were seized. Your income was sequestered. Only if you had a wife and children were you allowed to keep a measly 1/5 of your own earnings to keep them from starving. The war was being paid for by the systematic dismantling of the old social order. While the king had the support of the wealthy and a unified command structure, he lacked the long-term credit that Parliament's control of London provided. Royalist armies often had to live off the land, which is a polite way of saying they took what they wanted. They trampled crops. They borrowed livestock that was never returned. They turned the very people they were supposed to protect into enemies. By 1644, the war had reached a stalemate, but in the background, a new kind of logic was emerging. It wasn't just about religious fervour anymore. It was about professionalism. In 1645, Parliament did something revolutionary. They remodelled their military. They moved away from local militias who only wanted to defend their own home counties. They created the New Model Army. There is a myth that the New Model Army succeeded solely because of religious zeal, that they were saints in armour. But the reality is much more pragmatic. The New Model Army won because they got paid. Under the command of Thomas Fairfax, a professional outsider who stayed above the petty politics of London, this army became a disciplined, lethal bureaucracy. While royalist units were melting away because they hadn't seen a paycheck in months, the New Model Army was well supplied, well fed, and regularly paid. They were the first professional military force in English history. They didn't rely on the amateur gallantry of the nobility. They relied on talent, on regular drills, and on the crushing weight of superior logistics. At the Battle of Naseby in June 1645, the king's veteran forces were shattered. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a liquidation. The royalist cause never recovered. For the next 18 months, it was a slow, grinding war of attrition that the king simply did not have the capital to sustain. But as the professional soldiers marched toward victory, the ordinary people were reaching their breaking point. The 1640s were some of the coldest, hungriest years of the century. Crop failures were rampant. High taxes and even higher food prices were crushing the manufacturing markets. In the west and southwest, a new movement emerged, the clubmen. These were thousands of peasants and rural craftsmen who armed themselves not for the king and not for parliament, but against both. They stood in their fields with clubs and pitchforks, telling the passing armies, "If you take our cattle, if you burn our hay, we will kill you." The nation was exhausted. The great extraction had worked. It had provided Parliament with the resources to crush the king. However, this success also brought with it a series of terrible consequences. Parliament had become more tyrannical than the king they had set out to restrain. They had created a massive, professional army that they now couldn't afford to pay off or send home. By 1646, the First War was over. The king was a prisoner, but the peace was a hollow thing. The religious zealots who had fought the war were now demanding a new heaven and a new earth, while the ordinary people just wanted the taxman to leave them alone. The king, ever the mathematician of disaster, watched from his confinement. He saw the cracks forming in his enemy's coalition. He saw the soldiers arguing with their officers. He saw the Parliament arguing with the army. And he began to believe that if he just waited, if he just played one side against the other, he could win in peace what he had lost in war. He was playing a dangerous game. He didn't realize that the men he was dealing with, men who had seen the god of battles side with them on the field, were no longer interested in the old rules of the game. The extraction was complete. The old world was gone, and now the men with the muskets were going to decide what came next. Chapter 5. The Republic's Iron Ledger. The morning of the 30th of January 1649 was so cold that the River Thames had begun to freeze. In the heart of London, outside the magnificent banqueting house at Whitehall, a silent crowd gathered. They weren't there for a celebration. They were there to witness the unthinkable. Charles. I stepped out onto the black-draped scaffold. He wore 2 shirts that morning. He didn't want to shiver from the cold and have the crowd think he was trembling from fear. He was a small man, still possessed of that icy, fragile dignity. He spoke briefly, insisting to the last that a king and a subject are clean, different things. Then he knelt. With a single heavy blow, the axe fell. A witness later described the sound that followed as a groan, such as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. It was the sound of 1,000 years of tradition being severed. For the first time in history, a king had been legally tried and executed by his own people. The monarchy was dead. The House of Lords was abolished. England was now a commonwealth, a republic, but the men who held the axe soon realized that killing a king was the easy part. The hard part was living without one. Hovering over this new fragile republic was a man who never intended to be a dictator, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell is one of history's most polarizing figures. To some, he was a religious fanatic and a regicide. To others, a champion of liberty. But if we look at him through the lens of a content strategist, Cromwell was a man trying to force a rebranding on a nation that wasn't ready for it. He viewed himself as a modern Moses. He believed the English people had been liberated from the Egyptian bondage of the Stuart kings, led across the Red Sea of the Civil War, and were now wandering in the wilderness, searching for the promised land. And as their leader, he felt a crushing divine responsibility to drag them there, whether they wanted to go or not. But the Republic was built on a paradox. It claimed to represent the people, yet it was maintained solely by the power of the sword. The Rump Parliament, the small fragment of the legislature that remained after the army purged the moderates, had no real democratic mandate. 2. They were a minority regime, living on borrowed time and confiscated wealth. To pay the new model army and keep the Republic afloat, they turned to a brutal efficiency. They sold off the king's lands, the church's lands, and the estates of defeated royalists. They turned their eyes toward Ireland and Scotland. In Ireland, Cromwell's campaign was a dark, bloody ledger of conquest. The sieges of Drogheda and Wexford remained some of the most controversial events in British history. Thousands were killed, and Cromwell justified the slaughter as a divine judgment for the 1,641 massacres of Protestants. It was a conquest so complete, so ruthless, that it fundamentally altered the Irish landscape for centuries. Scotland, too, was integrated by force. By 1651, Cromwell had achieved what the Stuart kings could only dream of, a truly unified, though forced, British Isles. But back in England, the rule of the saints was failing. Cromwell grew frustrated with the Rump Parliament's bickering and lack of vision. In 1653, he marched into the chamber with his soldiers and famously told the members, "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing. In the name of God, go." He replaced them with a nominated assembly of 140 hand-picked saints, men who were supposed to be the moral vanguard of the nation. But these saints were even more divided and radical than the politicians they replaced. Within 5 months, the experiment collapsed. Cromwell finally accepted that he had to be the centre of gravity. In December 1653, under a new constitution called the Instrument of Government, he was named Lord Protector. He was now a king in all but name, ruling through a council of state and a professional military. This was the era of the major generals. Cromwell divided England into military districts, each overseen by a high-ranking officer. Their job wasn't just security, it was reformation of manners. They were the moral police of the Republic. They shut down alehouses. They banned horse racing and cockfighting. They even tried to ban the celebration of Christmas, viewing it as a pagan, popish superstition. Imagine being an ordinary Englishman during these years. You had fought a war for liberty, yet you now lived under a military regime that taxed you more heavily than the king ever had. You couldn't celebrate the holidays, you couldn't go to the theatre. Every aspect of your moral life was being monitored by a man with a musket. The economic reality was just as harsh. While the Republic's navy was winning wars against the Dutch and expanding trade routes to the West Indies, the domestic economy was struggling. High taxes and the disruption of war had left many families in a state of temporary economy, picking wild berries to survive, relying on the mercy of the parish. Cromwell himself was trapped in his own logic. He was a social conservative but a religious radical. He believed in the liberty of conscience, allowing a dizzying array of new sects, Baptists, Quakers, and even the return of the Jewish community, to flourish. But this very tolerance terrified the traditional gentry. By 1657, the situation reached its ultimate irony. A new parliament, desperate for stability, offered Cromwell the crown. They wanted him to be King Oliver. They believed that a king, bound by ancient laws and precedents, would be less dangerous than a Lord Protector who could make up the rules as he went along. Cromwell agonised over the decision for weeks. In the end, he refused. He couldn't betray the god of battles who had helped him pull down the monarchy in the first place. He chose to remain a protector, a man of the wilderness. But without the anchor of the crown, the Republic was tied to a single life. Oliver Cromwell was the only force holding the factions together. The army, the gentry, the radicals, and the moderates. When he died in September 1658, during a massive storm that tore through London, the Republic began to dissolve. His son, Richard, was a kind man, but he wasn't a soldier. He lacked his father's iron in the blood. Within 18 months, the army was in revolt, the treasury was empty, and a national tax strike was starving the government to death. The English people had lived through the execution of a king and a decade of military rule. They had seen the promised land, and they found it cold, expensive, and joyless. They were done with the saints. They were ready to trade their revolutionary visions for a bit of peace, a bit of ritual, and perhaps a king who knew how to enjoy himself. The Republic's iron ledger was closed, and a new, much more pragmatic chapter was about to open. Chapter 6, A Pragmatic Return. After a decade of shadows, the sun finally seemed to break through the grey clouds of the English Republic. In May 1660, the streets of London were not just crowded, they were ecstatic. People were drinking, dancing, and weeping with relief. The saints were gone. The major generals had retreated to their barracks. And riding through the throngs was a man who seemed the exact opposite of everything the Republic had stood for, Charles II. He was tall, dark-featured, and possessed an effortless, cynical charm. He was the merry monarch. But if you looked closely into his eyes, you wouldn't see the idealistic fire of his father or the religious fervour of Cromwell. You would see a survivor. Charles II had spent his youth in exile, wandering the courts of Europe, often penniless and humiliated. He had learned a hard, pragmatic lesson. Power is not a divine right, and it is not a holy mission. Power is a transaction. It is a game of management and compromise. He was restored to the throne unconditionally. He even backdated his reign to the moment of his father's death, as if the last 12 years had been nothing but a long, bad dream. But Charles was far too clever to actually believe his own propaganda. He knew that the England he was returning to had been permanently altered by the Great Extraction and the rise of the pragmatic middle class. His first move was a masterpiece of political healing. It was called the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. Essentially, it was a national forgive and forget policy. He granted a general pardon to almost everyone who had fought against his father. Only the regicides, the men who had actually signed the death warrant of Charles I, were hunted down and executed. For everyone else, the slate was wiped clean. Charles understood a fundamental truth that Cromwell never grasped. You cannot run a country if you are constantly trying to punish half of it. He brought former enemies into his government. He shared power with royalists, moderate parliamentarians, and even former Cromwellian officials. He realised that making his old enemies feel secure was more important than rewarding his old friends, who had nowhere else to go anyway. But while the political settlement was a success, the religious settlement was a catastrophe. Charles II actually wanted a broad, inclusive national church. He wanted to reconcile the moderate Puritans and the high church Anglicans. He even wanted to grant a measure of religious freedom to Catholics and the more radical sects. He was a man of the world who believed that God probably didn't care about the specific rituals of worship as much as people thought he did. But he was stopped by his own parliament. The Cavalier Parliament was more royalist than the king and more Anglican than the bishops. They were angry, and they wanted revenge for a decade of Puritan oppression. They passed the Act of Uniformity in 1662, which imposed a rigid, high church prayer book on every parish in the land. The result was a second Great Ejection. Roughly 2,000 ministers, about 1/5 of the entire clergy, were forced out of their churches because they could not in good conscience take the required oaths. These men became the nonconformists. For the first time, a massive, permanent divide was created in English spiritual life. Religion was no longer a unifying force. It had become a badge of political and social identity. Charles II watched this with a detached, weary cynicism. He tried twice to bypass Parliament and grant religious tolerance through royal declarations, but he was forced to back down both times. He learned that while he held the crown, the local gentlemen in the counties held the leverage. The economy, however, was moving toward a modern future that the king found much more interesting than theological bickering. The Restoration was a period of silent structural growth. The Stuart government finally got its hands on a stable revenue of about £1.2 million a year. Crucially, this money no longer came primarily from the king's private lands, but from indirect taxes on trade, customs, and the excise on luxury and basic goods like beer. The king's wealth was now tied directly to the health of the national economy. As trade flourished, so did a new kind of intellectual energy. Charles II was a man of the 17th century Enlightenment. He was an intellectual empiricist. He was the patron of the Royal Society, where men like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, and Robert Hooke were beginning to dismantle the ancient mysteries of the universe with the cold tools of mathematics and observation. The world was becoming secularized. The grand, apocalyptic visions of the Civil War were being replaced by the practical inquiries of science. People were no longer looking for signs of God's wrath in a lightning strike. They were trying to calculate the laws of physics that caused it. But Charles II had a shadow. He had a secret that, if revealed, would have destroyed his throne. He was deeply, personally attracted to Roman Catholicism. His mother, his wife, and his favourite sister were all Catholic. He admired the absolute power of his cousin, Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who ruled without the constant, annoying interference of a parliament. In 1670, Charles signed the secret Treaty of Dover with Louis. In exchange for a massive French subsidy, Charles promised to eventually declare himself a Catholic and to help France in its wars against the Dutch. It was a dangerous, high-stakes double game. Charles was taking French cash to stay independent of his own parliament, while pretending to be the champion of English Protestantism. The mid-1660s felt like a divine judgment on this cynicism. First, the Great Plague swept through London, killing nearly 100,000 people. Then, in 1666, the Great Fire of London turned the heart of the city into a smouldering ruin. To many, It felt as if God was finally punishing England for its perceived sins and the king's perceived lack of virtue. Then came the ultimate humiliation. In 1667, during the Second War with the Dutch fleet sailed right up the Medway River, burned the English navy at anchor, and towed away the flagship, the Royal Charles. The merry monarch was suddenly presiding over a national disgrace. Yet, somehow, Charles II survived it all. He was the ultimate political acrobat. He navigated through the fallout of failed wars, the collapse of his cabal of advisors, and the constant simmering fear of Catholic plots. By the end of his reign, Charles had achieved something remarkable. He had managed to stay on the throne for 25 years without a civil war. He had overseen the rise of a unified national economy. He had seen London rebuilt in stone and brick by Christopher Wren, moving from a medieval maze to a modern, rational city. He had successfully reverted to the mean. He had taken a traumatized, radicalized nation and turned it back into a country of merchants, squires, and pragmatists. But as Charles entered his final years, a new crisis was looming. He had no legitimate children. His heir was his brother, James, a man who possessed all of Charles's stubbornness but none of his charm. And James was an open, devout, and uncompromising Catholic. The merry era was coming to an end. The question of the crown was about to return, and this time it wouldn't be settled with pikes and muskets, but with the first modern political parties and a final, desperate revolution. Chapter 7. The Final Pivot. In his final years, Charles II achieved the one thing he craved above all else: a quiet life. A quiet life. He had played the game of power like a master of risk management, navigating through the turbulent markets of ideology and religion to leave the crown more financially stable than it had been in a century. But Charles was a realist. He knew the peace he had built was a fragile thing, held together by his own charm and cynical pragmatism. When the crown passed to his brother, James II, in 1685, the atmospheric pressure in England began to climb. If Charles was a man of the shadows and the compromise, James was a man of the absolute. He was an idealist without a sense of humour. He was a believer who viewed politics as a zero-sum game. The early 1680s had already seen the birth of something fundamentally modern: the first political parties. The Whigs, led by the relentless Earl of Shaftesbury, fought to exclude James from the throne, arguing that the law and the consent of the governed were superior to the blood of the king. Opposite them were the Tories, who clung to the ancient doctrine of divine right, believing that a king was accountable only to God. It was a battle for the soul of the state. Was England a private estate owned by a monarch, or a corporation governed by a contract? James II ascended the throne with a massive strategic advantage. Thanks to a boom in overseas trade, the royal revenue had swelled. For the first time, a Stuart king had the resources to maintain a professional standing army of 20,000 men. To James, this army was his leverage. I conceded he intended to use it to push through a radical social revolution. He didn't just want religious tolerance for his fellow Catholics. He wanted to dismantle the power of the traditional Protestant gentry. He launched a systematic purge of local government. He dismissed 3/4 of the country's justices of the peace. He replaced the elite squires with men of lower social standing who were loyal only to him. To the men who had spent the century consolidating their land and their wealth, this felt like an existential threat. The king was no longer their partner in order. He was a predator attacking their property and their status. James believed his plan was moderate and humane. He believed that if he cleared away the legal barriers, the English people would naturally drift back to the Catholic fold. He was wrong. He mistook the silence of a terrified elite for the consent of a willing nation. The breaking point arrived in the summer of 1688. Until that moment, the English elite had been willing to wait. James was in his 50s, and his heirs were his Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. They believed they could outlive his reign. But then, a son was born, a Catholic heir. Suddenly, the temporary crisis of the Stuart Dynasty looked like it would become an eternal reality. In a moment of extraordinary pragmatism, the leaders of both the Whigs and the Tories put aside their differences. They sent a secret invitation across the sea to the Netherlands, to William of Orange, the husband of James's daughter Mary. They asked him to come to England with an army to protect their liberties and properties. The event that followed is known as the Glorious Revolution, but in reality, it was the ultimate asset transfer. William landed at Torbay in November, marching his disciplined Dutch troops toward London, and James II, the man with the 20,000-man army, suffered a complete psychological collapse. He watched his officers desert him, he watched his daughters abandon him. He was a man who believed in absolute power, and when he realised he had none, he simply vanished. He threw the Great Seal of the realm into the Thames and fled to France. It was a revolution that avoided the bloodbath of the 1640s. There were no pikes, no massacres, no decades of military rule. Instead, there was a quiet, legalistic pivot. In 1689, William and Mary were offered the crown, but it came with a price, the Bill of Rights. The ancient theory of divine right was dead. The king's power was no longer a gift from God. It was a contract approved by Parliament. The king could no longer raise taxes, keep an army, or suspend laws without the consent of the people's representatives. The rising elite, the merchants, the lawyers, the wealthy squires, had finally built a wall around their wealth and their rights that no king could climb. Stuart England had been a century of tension. It began with a king who believed he was a god, and it ended with a king who knew he was a CEO. The world was no longer a stage for the personal whims of monarchs. It was a marketplace governed by the rule of law. The final pivot had been made. The old world of chivalry and bloodlines was fading into the mist. And as the 1600s drew to a close, a new world was being born. A world of ledgers, of science, and of the individual. Chapter 8. The Birth of the Individual. As the 17th century drew to a close, the heavy, ornate curtains of the medieval world were finally pulled back. The long, bloody shadows cast by the divine right of kings and the absolute authority of the state church began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, clear, and remarkably modern light. This was more than just a change in government. It was a fundamental shift in the human trajectory. We were witnessing the birth of the individual. For the monarchy and the Church of England, the 1600s ended not in a triumph of faith, but in an era of profound disillusionment. In 1603, the Church held a near monopoly on the English mind, a moral and intellectual authority that seemed unshakable. But by 1689, that authority had been hollowed out. The religious wars, the execution of a king, and the failed experiments of the saints had taught the English people a hard, pragmatic lesson. The state cannot force a man to believe. Religion was being depoliticized. It was being moved from the public square into the private heart. By the end of the century, faith had become almost a hobby, a personal preference rather than a communal mandate. People began to accept that a church was simply a voluntary society where individuals gathered to worship in the way they saw fit. The authorities stopped worrying about what adults did in their private religious meetings. The fire of the Reformation had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a landscape of pluralism and tolerance that we would recognize today. This secularization wasn't just happening in the pews, it was happening in the very structure of our homes. Think about the houses built at the start of the century, the great communal halls where the entire household, from the master to the lowest servant, ate and lived together. It was a world of hierarchy, yes, but also of intense, constant connection. But by 1690, the architecture of England had changed. New houses were built with private parlours and separate dining rooms. Servants were moved to their own quarters, physically and socially separated from the family. The individual was retreating into a private sphere, a world of personal domesticity and curated comfort. We were becoming a society of private citizens, rather than a single organic body of subjects. And as we looked inward, we also began to look outward with a new, rational eye. This was the era of the great restoration of knowledge. Men like Isaac Newton were dismantling the ancient mysteries of the stars. In 1687, Newton published his Principia, revealing that the universe wasn't moved by the whims of spirits, but by the cold, predictable laws of physics. The belief in magic, witchcraft, and spells, forces that had haunted the human imagination for millennia, began to collapse. It wasn't that the common people suddenly stopped believing in ghosts. It was that the judges, the lawyers, and the educated elite stopped taking them seriously. By the end of the century, it became almost impossible to get a conviction for witchcraft in an English court. The world was being disenchanted, measured, and filed away. This new rationality extended to the marketplace. By 1690, The old, regional economies of England, clunky, isolated systems where every area tried to be self-sufficient, had been replaced by a single, integrated national economy. England had become the largest free trade zone in Europe. Roads were improved, rivers were made navigable, and the shop era had arrived. You could now walk into a small town and buy sugar from the West Indies, tobacco from Virginia, or hardware from Sheffield. Wealth was no longer just about owning a stagnant piece of land. It was about capital, credit, and the movement of goods. The aristocracy of the late 17th century was a new breed, a world-class elite whose power was built on land, yes, but also on government loans, trade networks, and mineral resources. They were as comfortable in the coffee houses of London as they were on their country estates. Amidst all this change, one man provided the philosophical blueprint for the world we live in now: John Locke. In 1690, he published his second treatise of government, and in it, he uttered a sentence that would change history. He wrote that all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions as they think fit, without asking leave of any other man. Locke argued that the only purpose of government was the protection of life, liberty, and estate. He was the voice of a generation that had grown disillusioned with grand ideologies and divine missions. He spoke for the pragmatic individual who wanted to work, to trade, and to be left alone. The Stuart century was a crucible. It began with a society of subjects bound by blood and tradition, and it ended with a nation of individuals bound by contract and law. We saw the absolute power of kings broken not by a single revolution, but by the slow, relentless pressure of economic change and the pursuit of private interest. The human trajectory had pivoted. We moved from a world where our identity was defined by our place in a divine hierarchy, to a world where our identity was something we built for ourselves through our labour and our choices. As we close this file on the Stuart era, remember that the freedom we enjoy today wasn't just won on battlefields. It was won in the quiet ledgers of yeoman farmers, in the private laboratories of scientists, and in the growing realization that every human being has a right to their own story. The 1600s were a century of turmoil, but they were also the century where the modern me was born. And that, perhaps, is the most successful legacy of the most unsuccessful dynasty in English history.